You are listening to the Shopify Solutions Podcast, a podcast for Shopify store owners that brings you concrete examples on how to build and grow your e-commerce brand. Your host is Scott Austin. He owns a Shopify agency called Jade Puma. In this podcast, Scott will share his e-commerce insights and best practices with you.
Hey everyone, Scott Austin here, and this week we're going to be talking a little bit more about ADA compliance. We've talked to an attorney recently about that, and now we're going to bring in somebody from the agency side who helps brands make their stores ADA compliant, and that is Jordan Brannon from Coalition. Welcome, Jordan.
Glad to be here, Scott. Thanks for having me on, and super excited to talk about this most beloved of topics for e-commerce site owners everywhere.
Yeah, it is certainly the bane of many brands' existence, and it seems like it's only going to get worse before it gets better. So that's what I want to dig into a little bit here. Can you explain for our audience a little bit about what ADA compliance is and means for online stores?
Absolutely. Start with maybe just the base premise. American with Disabilities Acts came out as a civil rights action quite a while ago. And the goal was to make public spaces and even private commercial spaces more accessible to individuals with disabilities or different abilities. And as the internet evolved and grew, it became increasingly apparent that that was a common place of commerce, of business, of the opportunity for the consumers of the United States to be able to interact with businesses and providers of different services. And so there was this shift to thinking about websites as part of the ADA and having some oversight from the ADA. Unfortunately, the federal government especially has been very behind in establishing any clear benchmarks or standards. And as a consequence, most of what we think about with respect to ADA for websites is rooted in litigation. That's been its history and its means of growth. And I think even for the foreseeable future, it seems like the way that we will understand ADA compliance is really going to be determined by individual lawsuits in a lot of different jurisdictions. So today, any business that's operating online facing the public has some risk in ADA compliance. And that level of risk is likely tied to where you are, where your customers are, and frankly, how much money you make is going to come into play as well.
Yeah, and one thing I just got to drop in here, completely tangential, is because this podcast actually gets listened to equally by Americans and other English-speaking countries. So we're actually big in Australia, Canada, and UK. And for you people who aren't Americans, you have no idea how the American culture is all about suing one another. We sue everybody for everything all the time, and it's much less in your markets than it is in ours. So here in America, it's become a nightmare where brands are getting sued for not being ADA compliant. And like you just said, there are no rules for what that means. And we all just have to figure it out. So our legislation hasn't told us what the structure of those rules are. So the lawyers are, who are suing, you're like, oh, it's this, this, and this, and blah, blah, blah. And nobody knows the answer. So everybody's just trudging around trying to figure it out while paying money to lawyers, which is never cheap.
Yeah, I've talked to an attorney who has said that there's nothing more democratic than the lawsuit. That really it's one of the primary means of governance here in the United States. And accessibility is increasingly a conversation for Europe as well. The EAA came out, I think, this last year earlier, where it standardized European oversight. Fortunately, again, by a international ruling body, standards were created, which were clearer and perhaps could be a means for the United States to actually consider how it would approach some of its own ruling.
So what have you seen from the litigious state of things? Who's getting, you mentioned the more you make and all that kind of stuff. What can stores do to prevent or reduce their risk of getting sued? I'm just going to call them ambulance chasing, scum sucking shark lawyers, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not far from the truth. I'd love to believe that there was noble intent. There really was an emphasis on making websites more accessible for users who need access to them, but that really hasn't been the case in my experience. Most of the brands that we work with that have been sued have been small businesses, mom and pops that are really being targeted as part of 300 or 400 lawsuits per week. It's just this mass thing. So I think that the keys that we list for most of the brands that we work with, one, be really clear if you're online only or online and offline. If there is a perception that you are online and offline, it really does open up the places that you can be sued in, who you can be sued by, and frankly, how much you can be sued for. So just be really, really clear if you're a digitally native brand only, or if you are operating in a retail type environment, or even just have physical presence in some states. Make sure that that's really clear for you as being a potential risk factor. Beyond that, I would certainly say you want to make sure that you cover your basics early and often. So don't neglect ADA compliance activities until you've received a demand letter. Have a regular practice, set a calendar reminder. There's a number of free different tools that'll help you with a baseline audit, and just go through that practice of making sure you're reviewing. Because a lot of the ADA compliance issues that show up and get cited in those demand letters are pretty easy to address for a brand by themselves. They become much more problematic when you're trying to address them after that demand letter's already happened. And then the last thing is just be aware of your state's rules around ADA compliance, because again, where you are based and where your primary audience is based is one of the two big drivers of what will trigger an ADA compliance suit. So if you're not supporting or servicing customers in New York or California, Florida, Texas, or Illinois now, make sure that's really clear on your website. That does actually help reduce some of the targeting that you might have from the bottom of the barrel attorneys that are driving a lot of these.
When we talk about, make sure you're compliant, what sort of things make a website accessible, and what sort of tools can check for those things that make a website accessible?
There's a couple of areas. So traditionally, ADA compliance has really been focused on sight and sound. So just the ability to see and the ability to hear, and how well someone can see or hear. And is there anything in your website that for someone who is hard of sight or hard of hearing becomes inaccessible as part of their shopping or maybe service evaluation experience? So think sight and sound. What can I see? What's necessary to see if I'm trying to achieve a particular outcome on the site, or what is necessary to hear on the site if I'm going to really understand the business or be able to engage with, in this case, e-commerce products. So if you're depending on like product video with audio and with some narration, things like that, that's a really good trigger because it's becoming more popular now. I will caveat that quickly just by saying that motor skills are also a really big area that is growing in importance for ADA compliance, and future legislation is likely to emphasize limitations on motor skills as well. So if you think about that, site usually jumps out to e-commerce store owners as being the really obvious one. Like, how do you interact with a website if you are unable to see it? Or if you can't see it very well. And for people who are hard of sight, there are assistive browsing technologies. Basically, think about like a custom version of Google Chrome, perhaps, would be an easy way of connecting the dot, or an extension you can add on to Chrome that actually help them navigate between the elements of the site, usually for someone who's hard of sight via audio, or if someone is hard of hearing via sight, communicate to them, hey, this is what this particular element on the site is, what it does, what the content contains, and often they're navigated through keyboards that are adapted for someone who would be hard of sight as well. So think about like tabbing through a web page. Many of us have done that with like a form. We've kind of just tabbed through it. That's what a lot of people will do as they're navigating the site. And as they're tabbing through elements, they're going to be usually hearing, again, if we're sticking with sort of that hard of sight consideration, and they're actually going to be hearing what the elements on the site are. And there's specific rules that about how that flow should occur, how you flag interactive elements, how you make sure that something is essentially able to be read by an assistive browser versus, again, just assuming that someone is able to see that. We recommend a couple of free tools that are helpful in just evaluating and seeing, kind of what low-hanging fruit might be. Wave is a pretty easy to use Google Chrome extension that is easy to install, and again, should be part of like a regular check. There's another one called AXE, AXE. It's an acronym that, again, would be helpful for kind of a free and quick evaluation. There are third parties that do some of these surface scans, and for most small businesses, they actually are pretty effective in addressing a lot of those issues. Now, as you increase in revenue and traffic, you're going to want to increase the rigor with which you're looking at some of your accessibility.
Because your risk goes up from the shark suing you.
Yeah, most of understanding how the sharks operate is actually really helpful as well. In the earliest days of ADA compliance, we saw indicators that they were just buying databases of businesses, running them through a bulk scanner, and then just sending demand letters to everybody. As they've lost some of those cases, they've narrowed their focus more. They're looking for sites. Again, a real common practice is identify a New York City consumer who is operating with some disability or different ability, and then essentially prop them up for 500 different suits. But the attorney law firms that are doing this are working off of a database that has identified e-commerce sites that on some level are focused on that New York audience. Because Shopify is a very large platform, some of the crawling checks that they're doing for your checkout and for your cart that would indicate whether it's accessible to someone in New York are able to do that at a scale. So just being on Shopify, you might be scraped up into a larger list. This is true for most major commerce platforms. I don't want to just pick on Shopify only. But so they're taking this big list of technology vendors like Shopify, looking at sites that are accessible inside of New York, looking for language in your shipping policies that says you do ship to New York, and all of a sudden you've got a crosshair on you. Now, if you're a small site, you don't have enough traffic, you may not be showing up in those big lists. You may not be getting crawled or picked up by them as frequently, and you might be able to sort of duck and cover while others get caught up.
But I'm finding as time goes on that threshold of how much money you have to be making is getting smaller and smaller, and they're going after little people now, amazingly so. If I set up a Shopify store, throw in, one of the themes from the theme store, how compliant would my store be out of the box, let's call it, versus how much work do I have to do to make it compliant from whatever I get from Shopify and my theme?
That's a great question. Now, your base themes from Shopify, the Dawn example, will tend to be ADA compliant. They're sort of built for a base level of compliance. Now, the problem happens is that you don't just install the theme, you start adding product content very quickly. You start writing your own text content, then you start installing apps, and you start making your own customizations. And all of a sudden, you've gone from being compliant to being very uncompliant because of some of those changes. So that's where you really want to be attentive. Now, one of the most obvious ones is as you're uploading products, because every e-commerce store does this, alt text is extremely important. Super easy to produce at scale with today's AI technology. It's really not a good excuse to not have alt text for any of the image assets that you have. Now, again, if you jump off of sort of those Shopify base themes and you start to go to the marketplace, the Shopify marketplace or third-party marketplaces for Shopify themes, there's a good chance that you're going to run into some ADA compliance issues out of the box. So as you're shopping for themes, do look for that call out. If they're committing to some level of ADA compliance, there's a chance that some of that basic design elements, navigation elements are already going to be taken care of for you. The last thing I would look at is just your branding. Is your branding ADA compliant? One of the biggest areas where we see problems is brands that come in with low contrast between their brand color elements, or they rely on very fine fonts, which don't scale up or down well. And so you may actually want to think about building your brand in such a way where it is compliant. Some of the pastel color palettes that have been really popular in health and beauty and fashion and skincare over the last couple of years are really problematic because you have a light lilac or lavender or some, fleshy pink. What a lovely way of phrasing that. That just doesn't have enough contrast with other elements around it, and it's going to fail ADA compliance for that reason.
Yeah, so just so people understand, as you're talking about contrast, what you're talking about is text over a background color. And if they're too close together, whether they're both light or both dark, that people with vision capabilities, like they got to squint to try to understand it. There's actually metrics, there's the math you can put behind it to see what the contrast ratio is. And you have to be above a certain number to be ADA compliant.
Yep. And think about navigation elements, things that people have to interact with on your store. So your buttons, your form fields, if you have visually dividing elements that are helpful in navigating, like how do I separate my product description from my reviews? And there's lack of contrast there, that can be a problem.
I've got a store that I built, got a theme. It was fairly compliant, let's say. I added a bunch of customizations, some apps. It's no longer as compliant. I run it through the tools that you had mentioned, get a list of things to do. Can I just add one of those nice ADA compliant apps that I see in the App Store and then, do a victory lap, I'm done? Or do those help at all? And if they do help, great, explain that a little bit. If they don't help, what else do I need to do?
That's a great question. It used to be that a lot of those ADA apps helped. They were on some level an effective shield around your likelihood of being sued. Now, again, because all of this has been advancing through litigation, someone's sued and basically said, hey, these apps that are providing proximate functionality to someone with different abilities aren't actually providing real accessibility, and they won that suit. And they've actually been a number of suits now. And so what we've seen is some attorneys in practice appear to be targeting the widgets themselves. So they're not even necessarily looking for, are you accessible? They're looking for, are you using a popular widget that stands in for accessibility? So if you choose to go the route of using an app, you really want to understand what their commitment to you, their SLA to you is. If you're going to pay them $100 a month, what are they actually assuring you of in terms of protections and responses with those lawsuits in mind? If they're really just offering, we do ADA compliance, and our hands are sort of washed of any actual accountability following up on a demand letter or lawsuit, then you want to stay away. I would also say one really helpful filter we've been using is look for the apps that don't claim to make you compliant, but aim to help you understand why you're not. So more of an audit functionality and an alert functionality rather than a genie in a bottle functionality, because the audit and alert really does equip you to be much better prepared and much more preventative towards these demand letters should they ever come.
Do you have an app in mind when you say that?
We have a couple of them that we've used. There's an Access widget, and there's the Accessibly app. I think two that we had used frequently for smaller projects. And again, the emphasis is more on that prevention and actual corrections to your site versus, again, just some sort of magic silver bullet.
I've got this list from the audit app. You've now convinced me that all those great little free apps or low-cost apps in the App Store aren't going to help me fix my problems. What sort of things are going to be on that list that need to be fixed? And what sort of steps am I going to have to take to fix those things?
Yeah, first thing I'd set up is an accessibility policy on your site, publish it in your footer, super easy to implement. You want to make sure you, again, tie that back to a regular check. So you're going frequently. And as you're conducting your audits, that you are updating your accessibility policy so that it's clear when you last checked. Again, one of the things we've surmised from just, again, the larger volume of clients we work with is that we think some of them are looking for an accessibility policy, are looking for the last date, and then looking for a mismatch. And then if they find that, it gives them a sense that, hey, this is a good place to start with a demand letter. So get that accessibility policy live. Usually the first few things that you'll see flagged by these different apps are those contrast elements, visual size issues for navigation. So if your buttons are too small, or if the place that you can click or touch to navigate is too small, that's going to show up pretty frequently. Font weight, font size, again, really common one. And then alt text is just sort of everywhere all the time. So alt text being the descriptive text for your images. Now, there's a couple of places that I'd be careful with. If you use any apps to basically publish any images to the front end of your website, pay attention to your ability to control alt text in those apps, because they may not actually be managed through Shopify. You might have to go into an app configuration to make sure that there's alt text produced. So review apps that publish customer reviews with photos or videos. That's a really good one. Also, anything that's pulling in your social feeds, also be really attentive, because we see those commonly having issues with alt text. So those are usually the biggest, most frequently flagged. And then the last one may be form fields. So form fields need to have descriptive text for them that says like, hey, this blank spot on the page is where you put in your first name. And if that's missing, again, it creates problems for someone trying to navigate without a site.
And that's like alt text for the field.
Yeah, basically. Yep. Yep. Yeah. And there's a few different ways that can be implemented is that alt text for the field. Some form fields you'll note actually have the prompt text inside of them. They'll say first name. And so you can indicate that is that text for that particular field to help with those assisted browsers.
Now, one of the things I didn't hear you mention as a common issue, so I'm wondering if it is still a common issue, is tab orders and having to tab infinitely through things. Is that still an issue, or does the structure of most sites out of the box now cover that for us?
It's probably less of an issue for a more typical e-commerce business because the tab interaction is maybe a little less novel or complicated. So where we see tabs becoming a real frequent issue is financial services, medical healthcare providers, where you're doing lots of forms and you have to upload your ID and you have to do all these different things. Tabbing becomes really, really critical to navigation. Most e-commerce sites, especially themed from Shopify, you're going to follow a relatively straightforward structure. The more you customize your page layout, if you get creative and try to make your product experience longer form, 15, you're trying to create more of a squeeze type of landing page. It's long form, lots of inputs, lots of content, maybe even like for skincare clients, we sometimes have these beauty tests, like what kind of skin type are you? You really do want to pay attention for tabbing and that sort of experience because it does get in the way of actually checking out or taking advantage of a discount. And at that point, you definitely need to be thinking about ADA compliance.
Building trust in your store is essential, but let's be honest. Most trust badge apps make your store look worse, not better. Their badges clash with your brand and give your store a Frankenstein-like feel. That's why we built Badgezilla, the Shopify app that delivers trust badges that seamlessly match your brand. Originally crafted for our private clients, Badgezilla was so successful we turned it into an app for every Shopify store. With Badgezilla, you'll access hundreds of badges, all customizable to your brand guidelines, making them a natural part of your customer experience. Place badges on product pages, collection pages, the home page, and more. Take it a step further with conditional logic. Show a Made in Canada badge only on products made in Canada, or tailor badges to highlight your unique selling points. And the best part, Badgezilla comes with a robust, always free plan so you can start building trust, risk-free. Transform trust into conversions with Badgezilla.
I've got this list of items, and the stuff you mentioned don't sound that hard. And what I love in Shopify in the past year is now they have AI built right into your content section, and it'll give you the alt text half the time or so. It looks like it gives it to you, so you don't have to think and you just hit that button kind of stuff. And we actually go through our client stores and just go through their entire content list and click, 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 click. It's a lot of clicks. You can't do it in bulk, but it's way easier than having to create that content yourself. That's a big part of the work, and the other stuff sounds like a lot of CSS or some just design choices that you make, like, let's adjust the color palette, let's get, thicker fonts, let's go over here and adjust the CSS for padding on these things. They don't sound that hard. They sound like a pain in the ass, but they don't sound
Yep.
that hard. Are there hard things that do pop up that you haven't brought up yet that are, gonna require some serious heavy lifting?
Yeah, almost always it involves apps. Like that's the hang up for a lot of this is, and this is where actually a lot of brands that do get sued and do lose or do end up having to settle, it's usually tied back to their app mix. They've gone in, they've picked a search provider, a filtered search or faceted search provider who helps with the search text bar. And, half of that is not ADA compliant in any way. And frankly, they handcuff you on your abilities to make that ADA compliant meaningfully. So you start doing kind of kludgy things inside of your theme to try and make it ADA compliant. It becomes challenging that some of those apps, the way that they're coded, also bypass sort of what we would consider like the detection of some of these scanning tools that I've talked about. Like because the way that they're coded essentially is a black box, there isn't necessarily a clear thing to scan for some of these particular ones. So I would really suggest looking at apps. Those are an area where you probably will require some development help. Others, you can often now work with Sidekick, which is available and continues to see improvements for some of your main theme settings. You can make some updates as you're creating new content blocks within Shopify using Sidekick. You can also make sure that it's doing things for ADA compliance. So most of it you can take care of pretty readily on your own, and this is actually a strong suggestion, learn to do some of these changes by yourself because you're going to keep wanting to have these recurring scans. A really effective defense is a good offense. And so actually showing a history of doing ADA related work for your site as a small business is actually a really great response if you do get drug into an actual lawsuit, not just a demand letter. And so being able to show like every 3 months for the last 2 years, we've done an ADA scan. We've fixed these particular things. We've invested these resources. Actually, is a practical defense for a lot of these ADA complaints. And so, knowing how to fix those things yourself and where to fix them in Shopify, very easy to do with the age of AI. So, I'd encourage you to take that tack.
Yeah, and for those that don't know, Sidekick is Shopify's AI. I assume every store owner by now has used it, but if you haven't, it's amazing and it's showing up everywhere. And it's inside of theme customization. You can have it do things inside of your store admin. You can have it do things. So it's just always that's why it's a great name, Sidekick. It's always just sitting there. It's that little icon with the guy with the mask on it or something like that up in the upper right usually. Click on it and ask it questions and see how it helps you because it ties directly into all of the Shopify documentation and uses that instead of, like ChatGPT making stuff up. It's very focused using on data that Shopify has created to give you the right answer for what you're looking for.
If you have that simple app that it happens to be your ADA tripping hazard, Sidekick can help produce even some new apps that are effective stand-ins for some of maybe what you're doing already. The biggest gap right now seems to be it's not able to edit existing theme elements as readily as create new ones. And so just kind of be mindful of that. If you do have it make a change for ADA compliance, rerun those scans, make sure that you've kind of crossed it off your list effectively.
You're definitely recommending that people go in and, get their hands dirty and understand this stuff, run the regular checks. What if my store is so large and complex, I've got so many apps that our in-house staff can't handle this? How do we find a company like yours that helps brands with this kind of stuff? And what should we be looking at in those companies? What questions should we be asking them?
Yeah, I would look at one. There is companies like Coalition out there that really do put a big emphasis on ADA compliance and ADA compliance to particular standards, and do it specifically for Shopify. So I think do kind of narrow your search down to businesses that have a focus and an emphasis and a specialization there. Beyond that, I would say you want to understand what levels of compliance they're willing to commit to and put their skin in the game for. Again, because this is just really a liability question. If you're hiring somebody, you want to make sure that there is some, frankly, some legal protection. Is there some indemnification that they're willing to offer as a part of their services up to when they completed that scope of work for them? I would also look at understanding look at their portfolio of sites. Again, you have the free scanners and you have a list of their sites. Do a check and say hey, are these ADA compliant? And in some ways, look at that in degrees, because it is ADA compliant scans are only as good as when they were last done and as when they were last. A good example for us, we'll have a client who will work with us. We'll do a bunch of effort to make them ADA compliant. Their product merchandiser does a big batch upload of new products 2 months later from a new brand they're onboarding and completely ignored all of the instructions about alt text, right? And so you kind of want to have some ideas is the site itself actually ADA compliant? And there's some issues with things like alt text that maybe could have happened recently. But do check that portfolio. Do ask about how they conduct an audit. Is it simply just using those scans, or is there actual manual testing with accessibility browsers? So our team members, our dev team is actually trained to utilize assistive technology so that they can go through and actually experience it as someone who is hard of sight. We have some team members who actually have gone through some certifications through third-party bodies to actually essentially function as an auditor. And so you want to ask those questions hey, what's your experience with ADA compliance? Do you work with Shopify? Do you work with brands like mine and my vertical? Because that can mean a different mix of plugins. What are you willing to guarantee, at the completion of your work? How is your team trained for ADA compliance? Are they certified in any particular way, and by whom? What technologies do they use to help evaluate ADA compliance? Talk through that experience. That'll really be helpful, I think, in identifying who can support you.
And I think you said it early on, but it wasn't in your summary list. It sounds to me like some of these agencies will also be there for you during the litigious part of this conversation.
Yeah, and part of the value in having a third-party agency is that they can speak as an expert witness against a frivolous demand, right? So one of the keys in ADA compliance is that you, as a business, should be making a reasonable effort. Now, we use a specific set of criteria, WCAG, and there's now 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, AA compliance. You can go deeper than that if you want to. But for businesses, really, the courts have expected what is a reasonable effort at compliance for your business and for your audience size. And so if you have that third party, they can come in and say, look, this is a 1 million run rate Shopify store. predominantly working off of customers in the American Midwest. And they've done these evaluations, twice in the last year. They've, here's the things that we did. The reality of, the plaintiff in this case not being able to check out is fictional, right? They absolutely would be able to complete a checkout today, and would have at the time that they did this testing. And we have documentation to back that up. So that certainly is one of the values that we can bring. Part of it is also just the investment in the time and the reporting. The documentation, again, just shows that you've been committed to being ADA compliant proactively without needing to be sued.
I'm just banging my head against the desk listening to all the things we have to do. It's all great for, people with disabilities. I love it for that reason. But the fact we're focused on this because of the lawyers just being the
If the approach of finding out who to sue was not so awful, I would feel better about it. But it really is. I mean, it's they're using technology at scale to essentially spam lawsuits and demand letters. One of the most prolific law firms in New York that has been behind a lot of these doesn't even follow up on a lot of their cases. They don't even provide service, so they can go in and for $15 or $35, I'm not sure what the court fees are, they can file a lawsuit against 100 different businesses over the course of 2 weeks and send out an email to you saying you're being sued with a PDF attachment that includes whatever that initial filing was, but that doesn't count as legal service. And they won't ever actually spend the extra $500 to have you served because they don't care, because they know that as soon as they send that email out, most people start to panic with something that's got Court of New York lawsuit and my name's on it. People start to pick up the phone, they email them back, they ask for a settlement offer, they contact their insurance company, and all of a sudden they take in $3,500 for 1 out of 10 cases. And if they do that, 100 times, they've just made $35,000 without actually ever having to show up in court and just copy and paste a new business name in over and over and over and over and over again. It's pretty awful, right? And again, you can go onto the New York court sites and you can actually see who these law firms are, and you can just look at how many of these cases never even get service done, and so they'll essentially die in the court system. And really, that initial filing is just there as a scare tactic. It's fishing expedition to see who's going to respond, and as soon as you've responded, you're in the net. Your insurance company may require you respond. That's one of the catch-22s here. Not speaking as an attorney, sometimes not responding is actually a pretty good strategy until they've actually served you. But some insurance companies who offer cyber and digital type of errors and omissions may require that you notify them of a pending lawsuit if you become aware of it, and their attorney may get involved and may write that settlement check for you, before you even have any say in it. So.
Now, you were talking earlier on about having an accessibility statement where you explain to anybody, especially the lawyers, what it is you're doing. Do you in that put in the software you're doing for testing, the agency you're using to help you be compliant? Do you get to that level of detail? And does that scare away the attorneys because they're like, oh, these guys are legit. They've got it buttoned up and we're going to leave them alone?
It doesn't really, unless you're sizable enough. If you're hitting that, again, 1 million plus per year, you're more likely to show up and you're more likely to get an actual meaningful attempt at some point. Now, again, there are these spammers out there, but there's also the law firms that are really looking at sites that have enough of a footprint and deep enough pockets where they can craft a really compelling case against you for not being ADA compliant and will sue you for damages now, which is sort of one of the novel developments in the last year and a half with ADA compliance. And so they will look at those accessibility policies. And if you have a more rigorously completed one, absolutely that can be helpful in maybe preventing that. If you're a small business, the accessibility policy is twofold. One is letting them know you're paying attention to it. Two is also you provide a safety net, because one of the ADA compliance, it's not a get out of jail free card, but it is helpful to know, is that you have to provide some means of doing something for someone who is hard of sight, hard of hearing, has a difficulty with their motor skills. And so if you have some means of providing a checkout experience, some means of taking advantage of a discount that is reasonable, you essentially can say you're ADA compliant. So most lawsuits really focus on whether or not something can be done in a reasonable way by someone who is, it doesn't have to be technical. Like, it could just be someone picking up the phone and calling you or emailing you. Is there actually a customer service person who can walk them through the process? Is the phone technology you use compliant with ADA accessible standards? And those things actually can be good sort of safety valves that you can indicate inside of your accessibility policy.
That makes sense. Is there anything about this topic that we haven't talked about that our audience should know about?
Couple at one, there is hope that the federal government will actually create some unified standards, maybe inherit some of what's already been passed by states and by the European Union. There's some optimism that we'll actually have a clean standard that will be based in some realities for size of business. There was expectations that could have happened this year. It didn't really come to fruition. So we're hopeful in 2026 that could be the case. So pay attention to the news. I would really stress that one of the areas where this has gotten more harmful and more financially risky is that it's shifted into sort of novel courts within many states and large cities, a human rights issue. And that's shifted it away from a place where you mainly are paying attorney's fees and you're mainly paying to bring your site to compliance into a place where you actually can be sued for damages. So New York was one of the first where we saw this conceptual lawsuit tested. Illinois has now sort of been brought into the fray because of that. California, because ADA compliance has been moved away from, practically nobody was hurt by using your website. And so you're really being sued to fix it and pay attorney's fees. But now you actually can have damages attached to that based on it being a human rights issue. And that's made it a lot more attractive. That's why we've seen so many more lawsuits this year, because they can now actually pursue damages. So it's easier to find plaintiffs. It's easier to sort of take a portion of the winnings on top of attorney's fees. There's just a lot more ways for attorneys to make their dollar.
So I heard you say two things. One is it could get better when we have standards come through legislation. And two, it's getting worse until that happens.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The novel cases that tried it as a human rights are now scaling across other states. We've seen them come up in Florida and Texas and California, Illinois. I'm up in Washington state myself, and I think there's been even some attempts at that here. The large metro areas have their own city courts with their own human rights divisions. Those have been increasingly focused on as a potential place for these lawsuits to happen as well. So now you have 15 different fronts to be fighting this.
If a brand is listening to this and they want to reach out to you guys and get your help, how do they find you, and what sort of customer profile are you looking at for your customers?
Yeah, we focus on established small businesses. That's sort of our typical focus customer. So usually that means that you are doing a decent volume annually. I think our average customer last year, and at Shopify specifically, did about $3 million per year. That's sort of average. So we have a number of clients who are smaller than that. We are a Shopify premium partner. Our premier, I think they changed the labeling there. So Shopify premier partner. So we got a lot of experience there, both in the development and design side of things, but also in ADA compliance, and also have built a number of apps for Shopify that are available publicly. So sometimes we start those out as substitutes for ADA apps that are not ADA compliant. But coalitiontechnologies.com is the easiest place to find us. You can also find us in that Shopify partner listing. Quick Google search also doesn't hurt either for Coalition Tech.
Excellent. Well, thanks for your time today. I really appreciate you sharing all this information with us.
God, I appreciate the effort and getting the word out. Again, it's an area where you want to do good, but you also don't want the seedy bad guys to win. So it's a really worthwhile conversation to have.
You've been listening to the Shopify Solutions podcast with Scott Austin. This podcast is brought to you by Jade Puma, a Shopify-focused agency located in San Diego, California. If you like what you heard, please leave a review and subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to work with Scott on your brand, email him at scott@jadepuma.com.